So two things in this video. I'm not 100% sure which one's more important than the other. As the title says, the first one is about stamp duty or land tax. Which one is it? And the second one is about empty property.
And calls to dump stamp duty for land tax, the economics and politics of bringing in a big new tax.
Oh, and just to keep it interesting, let's talk about mortgage stress for a minute or two.
Mortgage stress is on the rise with a spike in the number of people falling behind in their payments. Mortgage arrears rose by 0.5% in the past 12 months alone. They're now at their highest levels since the GFC, according to the latest report from credit ratings agency S&P Global. Things are worse in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, with arrears rates of over 3%. And high household debt means the level of problem home loans is likely to remain elevated for some time.
And now the brilliance of the government. It won't be the first time I talk about the government and the greed and what happens when they start running out of money. But this came first to my attention, and I've learned from Martin Armstrong, who said that during the Roman Empire, Rome was obviously the most populated city in the Roman Empire, and it reached eventually a number of 1.3 million inhabitants. Now, what happened is that as the Roman Empire was fighting all these wars and running out of money, that came the need for more taxes, more money, more coin. So what they did is increase taxes on property, whether it was a land tax or stamp duty or whichever way. I think it was a land tax, where it was an ongoing tax, conveniently for them, where it got to the point that it was not worth owning the property any longer. So Romans started just locking up, packing up, and leaving. And this is when, at some stage, I believe in 260 to 280, Rome, the population actually dropped to 15,000. So from about 1.3 million to 15,000 inhabitants. And all it took is the Roman Empire to run out of money, to raise taxes on property, and for people not to see any value in owning any of it, and just, again, packing up and leaving the city. Now, this takes a long time. We're talking decades. How long will this take for any one of our societies for this to happen? Nobody knows. One thing we do know for sure is the stamp duty that we know is about 3.5–4%, and is just throwing away your money when you're buying a property from someone else, for the government to be able to write or scratch somebody's name off the contract and write your name down on that contract and the deed of the property, and say, now you own it, and pay me $40,000–$50,000 please for an average home. Just before you've even started looking at all the other expenses, you have to pay government $40,000–$50,000 on an average price home in Sydney and Melbourne. But guess what? Fewer and fewer people are deciding to sell because they can't get what they think they were able to get in 2017 and even 16. So they're holding on to their property unless they have to sell, which most don't yet. And that's mostly because people who are looking to buy are sitting on their hands and waiting for the prices to drop even further. So what is missing here, just think about it, is the transactions. So the government gets paid the stamp duty, the state government gets paid stamp duty only when somebody sells the property or somebody else buys the property. So when there's a transaction, and because there are fewer transactions, surprise, surprise, they're looking at potentially now replacing that stamp duty into the land tax, meaning that whether you sell or not, you are paying the land tax. But you can sit on your property as long as you want. We will just continue to collect tax from you depending on the value of the land, which, by the way, we will estimate. If it sounds familiar, have a look at my video on councils and how councils can overnight increase people's rates by as much as double, so 100% up. Which goes back to some of the points I made in a few of my videos, is that how much of the ownership of your house is actually yours. If somebody else can determine that you are now going to be paying an extra tax on it, and they determine how much you'll be paying or else. But the bummer is that we have to live somewhere, don't we?
It would be fair to say that nothing annoys a home buyer more than paying stamp duty. And it would also be fair to say that there's no housing policy more talked about than switching stamp duty for land tax. But what happens if you've just paid stamp duty, or you're just not keen on the idea of an ongoing tax? PwC tax partner Paul Abbey's come up with what he believes is an elegant solution to make it an opt-in policy. He joined me from Melbourne. Paul Abbey, this is an issue that has been kicked around a few times, but this time you've come up with something new in that there's optionality around it. Why bring an optionality into it?
Well, the critical thing with a move from stamp duty to land tax is that there's a lot of politics. People become very anxious. They've paid stamp duty to acquire their house. You now tell them that they're going to move into land tax. They're not happy with that. So the ACT had a solution to that, which is to transition over 20 years, but that's very difficult because you need a very stable political system to pull that off. So a solution is to give people the option. When they buy a property, they have a choice. Pay land tax at a relatively low level on the unimproved value of the land, or pay the stamp duty up front in the normal way that they're used to. And if you have that optionality, and if you also introduce the system so it only applies to transactions which occur after you've commenced the new system, so people who are already in their house are not impacted, then in those circumstances you can ameliorate the political issue, which is the critical issue in trying to get reform.
If I was to buy the standard house, it's, you know, property, $300,000, $400,000.
Million dollars in Sydney and Melbourne.
Yeah, okay, $1 million
Yep.
in Sydney or Melbourne. I think the stamp duty on that would be around $40,000.
Yep.
How long are you talking would I have to be in the house in order for the land tax to be a better option than paying the stamp duty?
Well, so the thing you'd think about with the land tax is that's going to be imposed at a very low rate on the unimproved value of the land, so not on the price you pay for the land, in a similar way to your rates are calculated, and you'll pay that over the life of your ownership. And if you hold that property, you could determine that land tax at a level. So if you hold that property for, say, 15 years, 20 years, depending upon the rate the land tax is imposed at, you will effectively pay the same amount that you'd pay as stamp duty. But the critical pricing issue for the land tax is really to think about it from the state government perspective, because what the state government needs to do in each particular state is to ensure that it's replicating the revenue that it would otherwise get. So it needs to understand for its population how many times do people move house in the course of their life. And
also that if you were to get rid of stamp duty, that would change. Surely people would be more willing to then transact.
Correct.
So how...
Exactly right.
Why would a state government, particularly the New South Wales state government that has reaped in about $8 billion off the back of stamp duty during the housing boom, why on earth would they even consider this to switching to a model where they have a very low rate of tax slowly moving across all of the property?
Two big issues. First, they know that stamp duty is a bad tax, and it's a bad tax because it makes people make bad decisions.
It's a good tax. It's an $8 billion tax for the state government.
It's an $8 billion. It's an $8 billion tax when prices are rising and turnover's high.
Thank you. That was a very good point. I don't normally interrupt these videos any longer because it is annoying, but it is a good tax until it doesn't raise any revenue anymore. So we're going to have to change the model so we can get our $8 billion every year. This is New South Wales only, some other way.
It's an $8 billion. It's an $8 billion tax when prices are rising and turnover's high. But as soon as there's a housing downturn, then stamp duty declines. And you've just seen, for instance, in Victoria, where the amount of turnover has collapsed in Victoria and the price growth has fallen away and we've had a little bit of price decline, is that all of a sudden you've got a revenue hole because stamp duty is an unpredictable revenue source. So for a state government, instead of having a very solid, predictable revenue source, which you can budget on a long-term basis, understand your outlays, work with that, you're working with stamp duty, which is very episodic and very unpredictable.
Just out of interest, like you keep referring to a low rate, what would be the rate, do you think? What's a suggestion of what that rate should be?
Look, it depends upon what each particular state economy is currently getting out of stamp duty, but you're looking at a rate of around 3 to 4%, depending upon what you predict your property growth to otherwise be, your price growth to be, how much turnover do you have, in how many times do people change house over the course of their life, and the fewer times they change, the lower the rate you could impose across a state. So once you've done with that, and you might also think about adjusting rates relative, to property values, but you're looking at around 3 or 4%.
And I mean, this idea has been kicked around for quite some time. There's a long and distinguished list of people who have called for it in the past from the Henry Tax Review on. Why is now the time to reinstate the call for it and reinstate the push for this to happen?
If you reached out across all of the economists looking at taxation systems and how they impact upon economies, if you talked to politicians on both sides of politics, if you went around all the different states, everybody would say that stamp duty is something we should do something about. It's well recognised that stamp duty is in many ways the most troubling tax for state economies and for the federal economy. Everybody supports it. You can get a lot of support for this idea, but actually getting it across the line is the challenge. And that's why we need to think a little bit out of the side of the box, and maybe optionality is the solution.
Paul, have you been great?
The conclusion here is that whether you are paying we are going to be continue to pay stamp duty, or it'll be the land tax, you don't own the property that you think you own, you are renting it from them. And maybe in one of my videos, I'm going to come up with a solution after all this research and all the interest rate and other changes that are occurring. I'm hoping to actually come up with what I think is a good solution for most of us. All right, the next segment is on properties or the commercial, light commercial property in the residential buildings that they're building all over the place, all over the shop. And when they build these buildings, the ground floors have a lot of shops. But what I didn't know, and this segment taught me, is, well, I'm not going to spoil it for you, so watch it. But there's one really important point I had no idea was the case.
Rows of vacant shops, the unexpected growth in commercial vacancies sparked by the boom in apartments. And suburban apartment blocks have exploded across the skyline of the bigger cities. And while that's brought a flood of people, it's also seen a rise in empty shops. Commercial space has risen by more than 30% in some areas, just as the fortunes of retailers have gone backwards across the country. And unrealistic rents driven up by optimistic valuations in the approval stage means shops could stand vacant for years. Daniel Ziffer reports.
A suburban mystery. New apartment blocks increase the population, but the shops below remain empty, often for years.
What's needed is a realisation that these ground floor vacancies will continue.
A lot of these developments, they initiated too much retail.
Claire Perry represents traders on the Sydney Road strip in Melbourne and says vacancies bring vandalism and downgrade the whole area.
There's no point in a shop sitting there empty for 2 years, 3 years, even 4 years, some of them. There's just no point. What's the value in that?
Value is part of the problem. Retail valuations are often based on the last rent received. So a shop sitting empty is more valuable than one that cuts its rent to attract a tenant. And any cut could trigger increased loan repayments.
banks in a way lock developers into some sort of straitjacket that they've got to keep the rents at that level. If they try and reduce them, they'll be asked to make up that shortfall.
Carl Fitzgerald from Prosper Australia says rosy valuations help projects get approved, but both developers and banks need to be realistic about current vacancy rates. Middle ring suburbs like Box Hill in Melbourne have been drenched in low-rise apartments. The think tank's research suggests as much as 36% of commercial space in that suburb is empty.
In order to keep the banks happy, they cannot reduce those rents, so they keep them at a higher price, and from that, they wait for the market to catch up to them.
David Burke has been selling and leasing commercial property for more than 30 years. He sees new apartments on the periphery of shopping strips suffering the most.
When these developments were initiated, council were very keen to activate retail activate the ground floor within these developments.
In some areas, the amount of retail space has doubled. At the same time, online shopping has chomped away at the amount spent at shopping strips. Approvals of apartments in 4-storey blocks or higher doubled to 4,700 across Australia in the year to January. That's despite overall approvals falling around 1% to just over 200,000.
This development in Box Hill illustrates the problem. Councils approving apartment blocks promote having ground floor retail, but online shopping is smashing the retail model. Developers don't want to pay a penalty to their bank by lowering rents, so traders and residents are left with this.
We look at a lot of developments and where you can just see from straight up that there's just not the demand that's going to be there to support the level of retail.
Mr Burke predicts population growth and non-retail uses like gyms and medical services will eventually gobble up the empty spaces. Back on Sydney Road, Ms Perry says shopping strips are adapting to a surge in services and online food delivery, but need help to stem the flood of vacant shops.
I think the councils have to look at the actual area that these units are going into and decide, do we need another 4 shops here to be either vacant or vacant for 2 years?
Full of possibility, but unlikely to be filled anytime soon.
I can make so many points about this last segment, but I'm not going to because I'm kind of running out of time. The video is already a bit long. But yeah, one of the things they already mentioned is that one of the gentlemen said that the population growth is going to kind of backfill all of these with medical centers and whatnot. But the one I was interested in, and I didn't know that if the developers tried to reduce the rent that was previously estimated in a very generous manner, if they try and reduce it, they pay a penalty, they end up paying more back to the bank. So the bank has locked them into straitjacket where they just can't move. They're better off just leaving it empty instead of just reducing it maybe by 10%, in which case they would pay penalties and end up paying more than they're already paying. So it's in their interest to keep it empty. Just mind-boggling. And as the mind continues to boggle, thank you all for watching. We'll speak again next time. Take care.